All right, no bad words, no audible bad words. You can mouth them. And I'm going on mute.
Excellent. Hi, everyone, and a special hello to Sherry's doggo who has entered the screen. So we are especially proud and happy to see her there. So thank you all so much for inviting me to speak today. TMAC is my professional family, and I'm thrilled to be amongst so many friends to chat about a topic that I really care about, which is monetization and negotiation. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Vanessa, and I'm a freelance writer, editor, and blogger. And I bring warmth and depth to travel and human interest narratives in outlets like Chatelaine, Toronto Star, BuzzFeed, Reader's Digest, Cottage Life, and others. I've been in the industry since 2012, and I help other writers with their business planning through private consultations and group planning days. Now, money and business is an extremely personal thing, and so is writing. So I thought it would help to share some of my philosophy about it before we begin so everyone has a sense of where I stand. I believe that everyone deserves to make a living wage and deserves to find a measure of fulfillment through their work. We're in an industry and economy, a geopolitical situation in which we have really no control, but I believe it is possible to have a sense of agency. I believe there's a world between these stereotypes of like being a starving artist on one hand and then being someone who's saying like, well, if you're not making six figures a month, you must be failing at this. I think there's a happy medium, a happy middle, and that's where I'd like to operate. And I really believe that the rising tide lifts all boats. It's only by talking about this, by sharing information, talking about rates, doing some research and discussing things openly that we really further our collective success. I really believe that learning is earning. So I'm really grateful to have you all here tonight. And for those who are watching on the replay, sort of on the video in their own time, thank you for making the time to be part of this as well. So despite the very real challenges facing our industry, I think there's also a lot to be encouraged about these days. I think our voices, our stories, our creativity matters more than ever in a world that's really craving authenticity. And I think these stories deserve to be shared with the world. And I think we deserve reasonable compensation for doing so. So here are some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would characterize as high value work and low value work. I'm going to talk about the terms deep work and shallow work and how it impacts things like our income and our satisfaction. I'm going to share with you how I calculate the value of my time and how I calculate the value of my blog and my time sort of as a digital presence. I'll go into what exactly negotiation is and talk a little bit about sort of the mutually beneficial values it brings to all parties. And then I'll also go into things like how I started an experiment with negotiation on my rates and share with you some of the templates and the conversation starters and the advice I have for negotiating with new clients, negotiating with existing clients, negotiating things beyond just the rates, like looking at other benefits you can talk about. What happens if someone says no, and how to talk, how to address that. Sometimes you feel weird, strange, awkward, uncertain about this whole thing because it's not a topic that's discussed a lot. And we'll also have lots of time for questions, discussions, dive deeper into things, all of that. So, not all work, as I'm sure you all know, is created equal when it comes to its value. For instance, a lot of people would say, hey, it's a lot better to do one assignment that pays $1 a word, 1,000 words, that's $1,000. That's a much better deal than, say, working at 25 cents a word. To earn that same amount of money, you'd have to do 4 essays for that piece, not just one. So therefore, we often think, okay, that $1 a word project is a very high value project. 25 cents a word, much, much lower. But of course, there are many, many factors that weigh into it. Sometimes it's not always so straightforward, and it does have an impact on negotiating. And throughout today's presentation, I'm going to be sharing some of the lessons I've learned about negotiating my rates. Some of them I've learned the hard way. And here's one of the biggest, and it ties into that idea of high and low value work. When I first started out trying to negotiate, I was doing a pretty good job of negotiating the rates themselves, but I was doing a bad job on selecting work that was high value to begin with. So I was learning the hard way that it didn't matter how much success I had negotiating something up from like $200 to $250, getting that extra 5, 10, 25, 30% on a subpar rate, it was still a subpar rate, just slightly more generously so. It wasn't financially valuable or viable, even though the negotiation itself was successful. So, as valuable as it is to negotiate on your rates, I think it's even more important to start with having a higher percentage of high value work as your baseline. In my life, there's room for a wide range of projects paying a wide range of things, as I'm sure it is in yours as well. But I'm trying to constantly increase the percentage of projects I have that are high value, and I'd hope you would do the same. The main factor I use in determining the value of my work projects is financial in nature, but for others, it may well be a combination of things like creative fulfillment, the chance to write about what matters to your community, the ease of the work experience, the professional esteem it brings, or maybe many other criteria. I know that these have all been factors at one point or another in my work. So even though I might be speaking a lot about money and finances, if you have something that you prioritize more, I think this can still work for you, just sort of subbing in those words. And I think it's also possible to recognize, important to recognize that you can possibly negotiate on many different things. And it's not just necessarily money or things related to money. Perhaps you'd like to say, negotiate how many photos to include in a story because you're looking to tell that story in the richest way possible, the way that story deserves. Maybe you want to negotiate a bonus day of personal time on a content creator trip so you can prioritize your mental health, that kind of thing. So there's many different aspects we could dive into. If you have several factors that contribute on to what makes a project feel like it's a really high value for you or potentially a low value, sometimes it can be difficult to know how to prioritize them. Like, what is more important? Is it that we have creative fulfillment? Is it the money it brings in? Or is money a little less important than, say, working with an editor who's kind and supportive? How do we balance that out? For me, when I have several competing factors, I like to make a list and rank each factor's respective attributes out of 10. I'm a list maker, so I make lists for everything. And I'm really looking to determine the average to calculate what's its overall sort of value or rate in my life. So for someone who might be working on a novel right now, that might be giving you like a big old 1 out of 10 for financial value. Not a lot of cash is coming in as a result of it for now, but that might be a 9 out of 10 for the creativity or a 5 out of 10 in terms of how it kind of affects your professional esteem. That might average out to, say, a 5 out of 10, making it a medium value activity, proof that money isn't the only factor in terms of what you're valuing in your work life. On the flip side, perhaps you're being offered a sponsored post for your blog from a company that you really don't like at all, but it's a whole lot of money. So that might be an 8 out of 10 on the finances because it's really lucrative, but it might be scoring more like a 1 out of 10 for personal values or a 1 out of 10 for creative fulfillment. It might look like a really lucrative piece. It might look high value, but the truth is that it's more like a 3.5 out of 10. That's a lower value thing. So negotiation, it might be a question of, do I want to negotiate for more money to make this sort of more worth my while? Do I want to negotiate for a bit more creative control so I feel better about it and that raises the value in other ways? Or do I want to realize, despite the fact that the price tag looks alluring, this is not a good value item for me to negotiate on, and I should save my energy and my time for different kinds of projects. All stuff to take into consideration. Another factor that I think contributes to this discussion a lot is the concept of deep work versus shallow work. So there's an author named Cal Newport, and he has a book called Deep Work, and it's one that I wish I had read years ago so I could get a grasp on what these concepts mean. To summarize it, deep work is really that incredible work that you are meant to do. It is your purpose, it is your passion, it allows you to operate in your zone of genius. Sure, it pays the bills, but it also feels deeply satisfying on a creative, intellectual, and financial level. Shallow work is everything else. That includes stuff that's important and serious, like maybe developing a marketing plan for your business. It could be something that's valuable yet kind of miserable in truth, like you're serving on a committee and you're having a lot of meetings that could have been emails. Or it could be stuff that's really menial, like scheduling social media posts, fussing over the format of your invoices, having your inbox cluttered up with a whole bunch of stuff. It's not really a priority for you at all. I feel that so much advice for freelancers and self-employed individuals, it focuses on the systems and the tools and the programs to get all this shallow work organized and under control. People tell you to get this app, get this program, but it feels like it's kind of like when people are thinking, how do I declutter my kitchen? And people say, well, just get kitchen organization stuff at the Container Store. That's not true. The best way to get shallow work under control or get kitchen stuff under control isn't to constantly reorganize it. It's to get rid of as much of it as possible so that you have more time and energy and resources for your deep work. This is a challenge because it means knowing really clearly what your goals and purposes are and not getting roped into unpaid work and not getting roped into work that's paid, but is really not serving your best interest. It's not really high or medium value work that's really kind of meeting all those factors, assessment factors that, truly matter to you. Now, in this case, the author, Newport, they're a professor, and they talk about things like they refuse to serve on committees in their academic field, but they double the amount of time they put forward for office hours for their students. Their argument is, well, I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, so that's what I should put all my time into. That's my deep work. I am not by trade someone who designates awards. I'm not by someone who assesses submissions. Now, he is coming from a position of immense privilege. So it's not like we can all decide to immediately say no to any possible shallow work. But I think we can take some inspiration from this approach. And why does it matter when it comes to negotiation? Ultimately, negotiation is an activity that takes up energy. It is not something that people feel comfortable doing. I don't feel comfortable doing it. Despite being here tonight, I still feel nervous or anxious before I'm negotiating an assignment. I think for most of us, we just don't feel like it's sort of in our comfort zone. So that takes some energy. It takes time to consider your best approach. You need to prioritize having the physical time, the mental energy to put into it. It's one of those things that we all agree, hey, that sounds important, but we rarely treat it like it's urgent. We ever really kind of put it as a priority in our life. And as such, shallow work with a deadline or timeline, it very often crowds out our available time or space or energy. And we use up all this mental fortitude with tasks that feel essential, but they really aren't. And that's why I think a big part of being successful when you negotiate your rates and negotiate the terms for your projects is really eliminating as much of this distracting shallow work as possible. Now, there's an element of like, do as I say, not as I do in this, because you can't eliminate every aspect of shallow work, and nor do you want to. I actually love it. I love having my logo look just so on my invoices because it's totally unnecessary, but it makes me feel polished and proud and professional, even if it used up a ridiculous amount of my time to do so. I love having my files color coordinated. I love having organized notebooks. So, take everything I say with a bit of a grain of salt. But I'm here to say that, if you're telling yourself, Vanessa says negotiation is important. I guess I agree with her. I'll figure that out in the new year. My question for you might be along the lines of, why are you pushing that further and further down your priority list? What shallow work are you prioritizing ahead of the more important task of negotiation? I think that being informed and knowing what your worth is a huge part of negotiation. If we want to create a world for ourselves in which we bring in high value work and stop prioritizing lower value things, we got to get a sense of what our rates should be, what our projects should be paid. But how can you do that in a world in which there's no standardized projects, there's no one way of getting paid, and so there's no perfect system. I do, however, have a system that I use for myself and often for clients that's proved really helpful for me over the years to give you sort of parameters for looking at things. The first thing I do is I calculate how many earning days I have in a given year. Note that these aren't working days, they're earning days. I don't earn money when I'm working at things like attending a conference. I also don't earn money when I'm doing my taxes. I don't earn money when I'm pitching projects. I don't earn money typically on weekends, my birthdays, when I'm at the dentist, stuff like that. But every December, I calculate how many earning days I can reasonably assume to have in the coming year. And each time I do this, it gets easier because I have a little bit more experience under my belt. So I know realistically, for instance, that there's not a whole lot of earning happening the day before I fly out to the TMAC conference because what am I doing? Probably a lot of shallow work, prepping different materials, getting things organized, all that kind of stuff. Next, I calculate how much money I need to contribute to my household each month. The bare minimum I need to clear after taxes and expenses and pay my bills and like the cat food supply. And then I do some math. What does that work out to? How much money do I need to, bring in theory, on each earning day in order to make my minimum monthly target? One year for me, it was $364. Another year, it was something like $403.68. I had it down to the pennies. And like, what do those numbers tell me? They're giving me a sense of, all right, for something to be considered high value or low value, what exactly would that work out to be? There might be certain projects that I think, wow, like $300, hey, not too shabby. Like that's a pretty good chunk of change. However, how much time is it going to take me? And in truth, that probably wouldn't be my minimal amount that I really ought to earn in that earning day. Now, should I still pursue that project? Should I think, is there a way I can expand upon it? There's many different ways to approach it, but it gives you a sense of sort of what is, you know, the worth, the money that you need to have flowing through your life. And you can break it down even further by asking yourself things like, all right, how many hours realistically do I want to work in a day? How many can I work? Is work happening when you're doing things like taking care of, your grandchildren or your parents? Is work happening, realistically for 12 hours straight? No, you take breaks. And having a sense of like, gee, I guess my hourly rate is this or this. You can start looking at things like, how long would it take me to do this project or do this article? Is it really working out for me financially? And this, of course, is just a guideline. There are plenty of days in which my old formula is not helpful even to me, but it's a foundation I can work with. Sometimes you do, for instance, earn money on a non-working day if you have passive income through your blog, your newsletter, your online store, stuff like that. Um, I'm guessing a lot of us are in this situation to a certain extent. What I do with that is I take these sources of income into consideration. I usually take an average of what I've earned from those passive sources for the past 3 years to sort of average things out and figure out, in a typical month, I bring in this much. So I can take that into consideration when I think about what my monthly bottom line is and stuff like that. So how does this help for negotiation? It's so easy to be seduced into thinking that something is phenomenal because you are such an awesome negotiator. You brought in an extra $100. Now, $100 is nothing to sneeze at. I'm sure we would all love to say, rifle through our desk drawers at this moment and find there is some forgotten money in there, a bonus $100. But perhaps even with that extra $100, that was never going to be enough money to make it a really financially viable project for you. On the flip side, you might try to negotiate something and you might only get an extra $25. And you might think, 25, like that other project, I got 100. Am I losing my touch? Am I not doing this right? Doesn't matter. You found a situation that worked well for both you and your partner. And if it's helping you exceed that sort of minimum daily earning amount, you're tipping things into the right direction. You're tipping things into your high value zone. Of course, as freelance writers, photographers, videographers, we have a much more straightforward calculation when considering the concepts of things like value and worth. We produce so many words, so many photos, so many minutes of footage, and we typically get paid accordingly. But the world is much more complicated when you're considering things like what if you have a small social media channel, but there's really high engagement? Or what if you've got like a blog with huge numbers, but you know that the amount of time that each visitor spends on the page is a bit on the low side? Even though this is challenging, there's also a lot of possibility because there's so many factors you can leverage as a potential value in negotiation. You might want to point out, like, sure, yeah, my Instagram might be small, but look at this incredible engagement I had on my last Instagram live video. These are all great things that you can put forward. So much like I like to calculate how much money I need to make in an earning day, I also try to calculate what my digital presence is worth each year and kind of revise as I go. There are tons of formulas out there on how to do this, but I'll tell you about a website that I found as helpful as any. It's called Hobo with a Laptop. So that's Hobo, Hobo, with a laptop.com. And on their site, they have a blogger rate card that is really handy. It helps you understand that a combination of your blog's traffic and your blog's domain authority really can influence the numbers you should be charging for things like advertising on your blog or things like your per diem rate when you're working with different partners. Here are two examples from like a recent calculation I had done with them. One is that if you have a domain authority that's maybe between 15 and 25, which would be a pretty new blog, and if your traffic was on the low side, like 5,000 visitors a month or fewer, maybe the amount you should look to be charging for, different collaborations and agreements would be between $75 to $225. If you have a domain authority of something like 45 or so, which would be a very well established blog, and if you have high traffic, say over 50,000 a month, you might be commanding much higher numbers, like 4,200 to 5,500 for a particular ad or collaboration. But I only use these numbers again as a guideline to have a sense of what my worth is. I'm also doing things like consulting with friends, colleagues. When I come up with numbers, I'm looking at what my performance has been, what my success has been on various things. I'm looking at case studies I've done, my local market, what my particular niche is, and my competition, all stuff like that. It's really comes down to a case of what will the market bear? And I think the point to take from all of this information so far is that any successful negotiation comes down to you having a strong sense of what you need, what you want, and what value means to you. And you can bet that the people you're negotiating with, be it an editor, a publisher, a PR firm, a DMO, another kind of partner or collaborator, they've already got a firm sense of what this means for them. So you need to do the same for you. So, what exactly is negotiation? To me, it is not about playing hardball. It's not about greed. It's not about, well, I guess we'll meet in the middle. It's not about, those weird encounters you have with used car salespeople. It's simply coming to an agreement that maximizes the value for both parties. This is about both people, both organizations, both individuals having satisfaction in how they're approaching things. So, for instance, negotiation might be getting an extra $50 for ingredients when you're working on a food post. You make compensation for the extra work and expense of testing a recipe, and the publication gets the assurance that you've gone the distance for your work. And this is actually an example taken from my very, very first negotiation where I did get an extra $50. It was from BuzzFeed, and it was to cover things like ingredients and time spent testing recipes and stuff like that. Negotiation might also be something like, asking an editor if you can get more than $200 that they've offered for their 1,000-word essay you're doing for them. And they're going to say no because $200 a post that's their policy and that's that. But they might say, well, hey, our minimum word count is just 600 words. So why don't you do a 2-part series for us, 2 essays, 600 words each, and you'll get a total of $400, much better than just the 2. Negotiation might be something like getting an extra 15 cents a word because you're conducting interviews in support of the piece or the project you're working on. So you're getting paid extra for your time and effort. And of course, they're getting a better article. Negotiation might be also adding an extra $800 on a press trip collaboration because you've offered them the chance to grab a photo package. You're taking tons of photos anyway. They might need photos for advertising or other type of concerns. So it's a mutually beneficial situation. I should mention that despite all these amazing, wonderful things that negotiation can be, there's also some limitations. We can't negotiate our way out of horrible economic circumstances. Sometimes there are just situations in which, hey, you know what, an extra 15 or 20%, no matter how good the project, no matter how valuable it is, in a difficult economy, that might not be enough, and we have to look at other sources of income. Negotiation can also be limited on the based on bias that other party holds with regards to things like gender or race or religion. And negotiation is rarely successful when a client, frankly, doesn't respect you. And there's a limit to what this type of thing can do. And at the very end, I'll come full circle and kind of showcase, what the conclusion to that sort of situation might be. So in a second, I'm going to detail my own negotiation experiment, how I started doing this, the scripts I use, the different approaches I take. But I just wanted to check and make sure that if anyone had any questions or concerns or anything they wanted me to clarify before I go forward, that would be helpful before I dive into some of the scripts and the specifics that I use. Seeing Sherry's thanks on the recommendation for Deep Work. Yeah, it's a really, really great read. And he has, this author, Cal Newport, has some interesting books as well about things like digital minimalism, which is super handy to convince yourself to spend less time on Twitter and more time pitching. But that's a whole other possible conversation. But if there's no other pending questions, I can dive into the details of my negotiation experiment.
Well, sorry, one of the things I would say now that the dog is settled down,
Yeah.
is okay, numbers, there's a number value that's great,
Mhm.
but sometimes it's how many hours does it take me to do this? Like I've
Right.
heard people say, "Oh, I wouldn't do that for $50." If it
Mhm.
takes me an hour to write it, I'll do that for $50. That's $50
Totally.
an hour.
Yep.
So, I mean, sometimes that sort of factors in what's the depth of the project they're wanting for that amount of money.
Hugely. And I'm the same way. Like when I was mentioning, I have things that most in my sort of work basket that some people might consider a low value or a medium value thing. That's exactly why. Because occasionally people might say to me, "Hey, can you do some listicle on like 10 things everyone should check out in Ottawa?" Yeah, I can do that with a lot of ease because I live here. I know it. I've done similar things. So the amount might be low overall, but I'd be like, "Hey, I can do that because I know that piece maybe they're offering, let's say, $100, and I know I can easily do that in 2 hours, and I know that my minimum amount that I want to bring in an hour might be something like 47 or something like that. So I'm like, hey, that's not a bad use of my time at all. Other times there might be things where people will be like, oh, like that was $800, man, that's like what a wicked payday. Well, not if it's one of those pieces that takes you a flippin' week to work on, because you would have been much better off doing those little $100 type pieces, that kind of thing. Um, it's also one of the reasons why I love to try to spin out more than one story from each particular experience or a destination, certainly, but even per experience, because there's a certain amount of time that for each piece you do is kind of non-recoverable, like a certain amount of, say, setting up to get an interview done and all that sort of thing to get your quotes. And afterwards you realize, well, that was a great interview, but I've got like 10 minutes of quotes that I can't use. But if I could sell a second piece that might be a lower cost or something like that, or a different angle, and I can like pull in those quotes, suddenly this piece seems to like go much more snappily because I've done my research, I've done my quotes. So I'm looking at how can I sort of squeeze out some extra money from that. So those are some of the things that I use those numbers for to kind of help me along in that regard. And I thought I'd seen Bruce, was your hand up as well, or was it just
Yeah, I have a quick question. I
please?
believe I understand the difference between shallow and deep work,
Yeah.
but could you summarize what you meant by selecting work that is high value? I didn't know if you meant to yourself or in terms of monetary value.
Totally to yourself, but it often does correspond monetarily. Um, it depends. Like you might have an excellent relationship with a particular editor, and you might think, well, their pay isn't great, but because they are so fantastic to work with, and I know there won't be any
That's high
nonsense
value.
back and forth, this matters a lot to me. And in my own life, an example of that, and perhaps you guys write for them as well, is at Cottage Life. They pay modestly for the digital pieces. To be transparent about rates, I typically get paid about $125 for a 400-word digital piece. So per word, not too bad, but it's definitely a more modest pay thing. But they have always been excellent to work with me. They're polite, they're encouraging, they're friendly, they're warm, they have great suggestions. Their edits are always done in a way that makes me think,
Mhm.
this makes me a better writer, as opposed to sometimes edits feel a bit mean. They're always fantastic. So the pay for like from them might be more of a 5 out of 10 in my world, but the experience of working with them, that ease is more like a 9 out of 10. And I love that. That is, a really great experience.
Okay.
If they were like total jerks and it was like a 1 out of 10 to work with them, I probably honestly wouldn't do it because the money wouldn't be enough. But combined with the sense that they're so wonderful to work with, I'm like, this is an outlet where I really, value this relationship so much. Someone else might not enjoy that editing style at all. And so for them, it might be a different thing altogether. Or someone else might value them for different reasons. They might say, like, oh, I love how they let me be so creative when I talk about this, festival or something. So they might value the creativity. And in my world, I always try to think I want at least 50% of my work to be what I would consider high value. So for me, it's stuff that really hits that like 7 out of 10 mark or higher. So that's good money, but also excellent working relationships. I want at least half of my work life to be that. And I think who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to have good income, good relationships? But there's also room in there for a lot of different things. And I think a lot of smaller projects we start or creative ventures, we're not entirely sure where they're going to go financially, but they matter a lot to us personally for various reasons. So we're willing to sort of set a time in our schedules to make room for them. And I think that's all the more value to negotiate, even on high value things, because we probably all want the financial freedom to have a little bit of flexibility to try our hand at different creative things. And if they don't work, it's okay, because we're bringing in decent money and financial compensation from the more traditional things that we're working on. I hope that was clear as mud.
I think that's what I understood the first time, but now I'm sure.
Okay, awesome. So many people, they go their entire life without ever asking for a raise. Since 2022, I've been doing it just about every day, or nearly so. As a freelance writer, I diligently keep my eye on the bottom line. I know that a lot of my success doesn't come from the fact that, oh, I have brilliant ideas. No, it comes from my ability to manage my self-employed life, my business life as a business. And in this really increasingly uncertain economy, I think that matters more than ever. So I knew, hey, if I want to thrive, I'm going to have to start asking some hard questions, starting with the one that most people dread, which is saying, is that the best you can do? So that is now a query I've been raising with editors now for since 2022. And I was motivated to tackle my rates in part because of the hosts of a podcast called the Writers Co-op Podcast. At the time, the hosts were Wudan Yan and Jenny Gritters. So Yan and Gritters really encourage writers to value their work and their personal time, to raise their rates and negotiate assignment fees instead of simply taking on additional work. There's only so many hours in the day. And they're saying that this is sort of the meaning of working smarter, not harder. Instead of trying to get, another project squeezed into your week, what if the projects you're working on just paid you better? And this felt both like so bewitchingly simple that it couldn't possibly work. It also felt outrageously audacious. Like, could I just do that? Could I just say, I want more money? Like, who am I? Like, why would I do that? I was like, it turns out I could, and so can you. So starting in 2022, I vowed to ask every signing editor for more than the fee that they offered, no matter how big or small the piece, no matter how big or small the pay. However, the idea of negotiating anything, let alone everything, is like a misery to me. I don't feel like a natural to this. I'm a big chicken. I knew I needed a way to stay accountable to myself, because when my courage would fail, and it would, I needed to kind of like have a visual reminder. So I decided to track my efforts on a chart, and they were soon rewarded. As I mentioned, my very first negotiating attempt earned me an extra $50. Since then, 68% of my assignments have benefited from me being willing to ask for more. And in doing so, my confidence has soared. My best ever result was getting an extra 150 US dollars, which I think with the exchange rate is about 8,000 Canadian right now. And this is on a piece that I had pitched 14 times. And I finally got a yes on the 15th time. It was with Thrillist, and they were going to pay me 650 US, which already was pretty great, but they wanted the copy in a reasonable, pretty quick timeline. So I said, oh, given the deadline, is that the best you can do? And they're like, well, actually, we could do 800 American. And that sounds like a pretty amazing sort of payday for what was less than 30 seconds worth of work. There's no script to guarantee any kind of success in negotiating with a client. However, I found it's incredibly helpful to have like little conversation starters, some key sentences to have by your side so you know how to approach things. I'm going to go through a bunch, but I actually have a list of 41 of them that I use for different occasions. And if you'd like a copy of all of them, it gets sent automatically to anyone who subscribes to my Substack newsletter. So if you're on Substack or you go to substack.com, you can just search for my full name, Vanessa Chiasson, and my newsletter will pop up along with my picture. And my newsletter is called The Clothesline. So that's me. If you subscribe to that, you'll get this full PDF with all of them. So I'm going to start with how I negotiate with new clients. And as I mentioned, when I was chatting with Bruce there, I try as much as possible to make my new clients to be higher value clients, because I prioritize higher levels of income, higher levels of personal satisfaction in my work. But of course, in my diversified business, there's room for all sorts, but I'm really looking to establish these relationships and really have those high value clients. So it helps to have outlets that are really sort of respectful to your level of clear communication on this. So I'm trying not to pitch unless I have a good sense that, you know what, I know that probably the baseline amount they're going to be offering is still okay. So if they say no, I'm still okay with like the baseline that they're offering. Because in truth, had Thrillist said no in that example I just mentioned, I still would have done the assignment. But I figured it doesn't hurt to ask for more, and it worked out for me. And I know that you have felt my frustration in which you go into a situation, you pitch a project or a story, and they're like, oh, sure, but we don't have any budget, or we can't pay that much. Like, I've been speed dating at a certain conference, and you realize, oh, you don't have a budget for bloggers or content creators? Why did you request this meeting? Or you put time and energy into doing a pitch or proposal, and then you're like, oh, what do you mean you only pay this amount or something? So this is why I love groups like TMAC, so we can have trusted colleagues and friends to connect with, to share information frankly, so we know before we go into these situations of negotiating, it's not really a case of I can only do this project if they're willing to up the rate. It's more a case of this project is cool with me if they can't negotiate, but if they can, even better. It's, I think, the best use of everyone's time. So I'll give you some examples of the phrases and the conversation starters I use the most with new clients, and they're pretty simple. I say things like, I can't wait to work with you on this piece. Would you have any wiggle room in your budget? This sounds like such an amazing project. Are you able to increase your hourly rate at all? I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't ask. Is that the best you can do on the rate? For these kinds of stories, I typically charge this amount per word. Can the publisher meet that? I'd love to check on some details. Can you please confirm the word count, your delivery method, and can you let me know if there's any wiggle room in the budget? I would say that I use these 90% of the time when I'm connecting with a new client. But sometimes I find it's helpful to use a sense of justification when I am negotiating. And I don't mean justification as in, well, like I have to repair my dishwasher this month. Can you give me more? And I don't think anyone should have to justify the need for a living wage. I think sometimes, however, it's easier to sort of peg a request to a specific reason if there's a need for more money. Like, this piece will involve more interviews than normal. Are you able to raise the rate? This is a very sensitive piece to work on. Do you have any wiggle room in your budget? Before I commit to sharing my story in such a personal essay, I'd like to chat about the rates. Are you able to pay this amount a word? This is a controversial topic, and I need to consider the potential impact of online harassment. Do you have flexibility with your proposed compensation? To be blunt, I know this piece will be polarizing. My name will be attacked along with the subject. Can you offer a better rate for this kind of intense assignment? Or simply, hey, this assignment involves testing some recipes, checking out campgrounds, procuring craft supplies. Can you increase the rate to account for the extra time and expense of this project? Of course, not all of our negotiation is going to be with new clients. Sometimes it's clients that are existing clients or perhaps people we've worked with before and we're coming around to working with them again. Any experienced editor or competent business owner or experienced member of a DMO or PR firm, they will understand that things like rates and fees don't stay static. People like plumbers, IT technicians, catering companies, they adjust their rates all the time, and it's okay if freelancers do the same. Sometimes I find that asking for more money and tying it to a certain date can be a confidence booster. Sometimes it feels a bit random to say, oh, it's April 13th or August 7th. Can I get more money? Sometimes it's easier to peg it to things like back to school or the new year is often a common one. So here's some potential conversation starters that you can use to sort of peg a negotiation to a specific calendar date. You can try things like, hey, I wanted to give you advance notice that starting on July 1st, my hourly rate will increase to, by $5. As always, I'm grateful for our ongoing partnership. You can try, in the new year, my rates will increase by 10%. I look forward to continuing our work together, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Or, please be advised that starting September 1st, my rates are going to increase from this amount to this amount. I appreciate your support, and I look forward to future projects. Sometimes you can also do a similar thing using certain milestones as a prompt when you're talking with existing clients or those who are reemerging after a bit of a time away from working with you. You could say something like, since we last worked together, my rates have increased to whatever the amount is. It's one of the most surprising things when I talk with people about negotiation is how often they'll say to me, like, oh, like I haven't worked with this person or this client or this group since 2021. And like the pay wasn't that great then. Like, I don't really want to do it again for the same amount. I always say, don't. It is perfectly reasonable to say, like, my rates have increased too. I was at the massage therapist's office the other day and they had like a little sign on the office, like the desk edge saying, like, in January 1st, our rates will be as follows. I think it's a really natural thing that we encounter in so many other sectors of our life. And yet sometimes when we're a business of one or when we don't have a formal office, we feel like it's somehow strange to say to an existing client that your rates have gone up. Or maybe they assume they're grandfathered in. I think the most simple way is simply to say, hey, since we last worked together, my rates have increased to this amount. You can also try things like, since I earned my MA last fall, my rates have been set at this. Now that I've passed the 10-year mark in business, I've increased my per word rate to this to reflect my seniority. And as a side note, you can decide entirely for yourself if you're a senior freelance writer or not. I've decided I'm one. Why not? Who's there to contradict me? We can all be senior writers and get paid accordingly. And we can also say things like, hey, this marks my 3rd anniversary of freelancing with you. I'm so proud of the pieces we've worked on together. Could we have a call to discuss my rates going forward? I'd like them to be in line more with my other projects are at. And there's so many different ways to approach this. It could be everything from a call to really discuss things to, hey, this is the new rate, and that's that. It really depends on the client, the type of collaboration, the type of project it is, all of those different things. And sometimes the effect you might want to have isn't necessarily saying, oh, I want this much or that much more. It might be more, I don't want to be doing any more of the low paying work with you. I'd rather be doing, frankly, the better paying stuff. Sometimes different publications and different projects and different people we collaborate with, sometimes certain things just don't hit as strong on that value scale as others. And you want to shift over to that. So you might want to say something like, starting on January 1st, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to continue doing the monthly business leader profiles because I'm going to be focusing more on feature stories in the coming year. I hope that includes features for you. So I'd love to send you some story pitches next week. So you're basically saying, I'm not going to do this, like these small, piddly little things. I'd really love to be doing like the well-paid features. So that's what I'm prioritizing. And you have every right to do so. You can say things like, I've enjoyed working on these digital pieces with you. I'd love to offer you some pitches for print as well. Do you have an editorial calendar you can share? You can try saying, I've enjoyed working with you on this vertical. I understand that your hands are tied, however, regarding rates. I'd love to collab again in the future on some higher paying projects. Can I reach out in January and check on what your editorial needs are? You can also be really blunt and say something like, hey, to be frank, as much as I've enjoyed working on these particular pieces, I really need to free up my calendar for higher paying features. I hope we can connect when you need such and such a thing profiled during the summer season. And another great one to say is, do you have any sponsored content that you need help with? Very often, sponsored content is paid at a higher rate than, say, something that is paid for out of the magazine or organization's operating budget. Also, I think you can look at negotiating more than just money. So, you know how the story goes, I'm guessing. You negotiate what you think's a good rate for a reasonable project, and then there's a little creep that begins. People start asking you, oh, what about photos? What about recipes? What about sidebars? What about social media promotions? That is all extra stuff that you should be paid for. So some of the things you can use in these situations to kind of push back and say, hey, you can have these extras, but that means we're negotiating in a fresh way. You can say things like, do you have a budget for photos? You can say things like, I'm letting all my clients know starting on this date, I'm not going to be sitting in on staff meetings unless it's necessary. It's much more efficient for me to focus on story development instead. My new policy is that I'm going to charge this much an hour to attend meetings. And this one in particular works great for people who have corporate clients who are always sending you meeting invites because it might just be interesting. You can say things like, can you increase the rate to account for using my images? You can try, what's your usual rate for adding a recipe to a food article? You can try, are you able to pay extra for sidebars? You can say, for rush jobs, I typically charge an extra amount. You can say, my typical rate for turnaround times of less than a week is this. Are you able to meet this? If you like a social media promotions package, I have one. It costs this amount and includes these posts, these networks. Otherwise, I typically only share new pieces to my portfolio. And lastly, you can also look at changing the work conditions, not just the money, which might actually be the best financial plan in some regards. And especially if you're working on passion projects with lower rates. And again, this comes down to the financial value might be low, but the creative value, the personal fulfillment value, the professionalism, that might be quite high. So what are the things that you can negotiate on in those types of scenarios that really make it a much higher value for you overall, even if it's not always a financial winner? You can say things like, hey, I bet there's a solution that can work well for both of us. If the rate's already set in stone, do you have any flexibility on the word count? And this is what I've done actually in the past with Saltscape magazine, which is a print magazine covering Atlantic Canada. They're lovely to work with, but they're one of these places where the policy is this is the amount they pay for this type of article, and that's that. But they have been able to lower my word count a little bit. And this has been hugely beneficial because it effectively gives me an increase in the amount I'm being paid per word. Not a huge amount, 5-10 cents. But if they ever change their payment model, if they ever sell, if there's ever a new manager, I can then say, oh, what I typically get paid by you is this. So I'm already sort of kind of grandfather clausing myself into a higher rate, even though the amount overall is still the same. You can ask to say, break a piece into a series or do a two-part, two-part or something like that. If a place is, they can only pay a max amount per article. They can't negotiate on that. Maybe they can give you more articles and a lower word count to make it a series. You can also ask to have the rights, the writer's rights, addressed in your contract. You can say, hey, I'd like the flexibility of offering this piece to an international publication next year. Can we adjust my contract to make sure that I retain the rights? Which frankly, probably should be the case in every contract, but that's a conversation for another day. You can also say things like, hey, do you typically syndicate your content across several platforms or websites? Are you able to increase rates for these extra publications? Maybe something like that will work out to your advantage. And I'm guessing you're probably all wondering though, like what happens when someone says no? And people say no. They say no a lot. Like I've had a lot of success, but that I've also had a fair bit of being refused. As I mentioned before, with new clients, I have a sense going in, are they someone for whom their baseline rate will still be okay with me? So I'm rarely in a position of like everything hangs on the balance of what they say yes or no to. But I still really obviously want to have that yes. This is never my favorite thing to do. But because I've been doing it for so much now, it no longer feels intimidating. I feel like I'm getting stronger with every, time I go through this process. And to me, it's no longer a huge scary thing. It's simply another good freelance business practice. It's right up there with tracking receipts and making your deadlines. And I'm here to say that pushback is rare. 99% of the editors will either say yes or they will say no, but in a reasonable, kind way. Pushback almost never happens. However, I feel personally that it boosts my confidence a lot to sort of feel prepared with some possible responses in case someone gives me a bit of pushback. So if anyone says like, oh, your rates seem awfully high, I like to say, hey, like all small business owners, I regularly review my rates and market conditions to establish a fair price for all parties. Sometimes people will say something like, oh, I expect really good content if I'm going to be paying you more. Something like that. You can say, hey, I look forward to negotiating, with you in the future, but like I'm right now looking forward to delivering the same high standards that I'm always commit to my writing. AKA, my writing was great before, it's going to be great going forward, and you're going to pay me the market rate. Sometimes people have come to me and said like, oh, actually, like we have to make cuts. Cuts are happening. The board, the budgets, all this stuff. I've said things like, hey, if the board can't increase your budget, like it's not your fault, maybe it's your board, your publisher, all these different things, I can actually decrease my hours so your finances remain the same and my rate criteria is met. However, we're going to have to draw up a new agreement to reflect a more limited project scope. Sometimes people might say things like, oh, I don't know if we're going to be able to afford you anymore. Well, then, you can say something like, hey, as my business grows, I won't remain accessible to all market segments. And incidentally, that's not my job or your job to be something that everyone can afford. For budget-minded clients, I have a new workshop that will meet your needs if you want to take things in-house. So, hey, you can do the work and you can pay me a more modest amount to tell you how to do that work. Or you can simply say either, I am confident that my rates reflect an excellent market value, or I'm sorry you feel that way and I wish you all the best. But thankfully, I've never once had to say any of those things, though I've imagined them all in my mind many times when I'm sweating out how a negotiation will go. One of the most surprising things about my negotiation experiment is that editors who said no were my biggest cheerleaders. They encouraged me to keep asking, and they often said they regretted that they weren't in a position to do more. And I wrote about my experience with all of this for the Canadian Freelance Guild. They have an online publication called The Storyboard. And I interviewed one of my editors who said no about why they were still so encouraging to say no. And the editor in question, his name's Tom Firth. He's the managing editor of Culinaire magazine. I said, what motivated you to be like so supportive when you said no to me? And he said, I completely understand getting that if there's more budget or something like that, he'd like to work with that. It's not something I like being asked about, but generally, I rarely have a favorable answer. So that's why I don't like being asked about it. But it does keep us thinking about our rates. I never mind being asked, and I firmly believe that if I'm being asked politely or openly about the budget, I can certainly reply in much the same fashion. And this takes me back sort of full circle to the beginning when I was saying there's certain things that negotiation can't help. Like if a client doesn't respect you, all the negotiation in the world isn't going to help that. But I have found that asking about rates and negotiating has given me so much more than extra spending money. It has become a litmus test to determine how the people I'll potentially be working with will treat me. Will they be clear and kind in their communications? Will they treat my work and my efforts with respect? Are they warm? Are they friendly? Are they polite? Are they encouraging? Are they professional? And at the beginning, we're talking about all these different pillars of value and how finances is one of the biggest ones. But we're also talking about other things like the ease of a project, the professional esteem and pride you feel. I always want to enjoy my work. I always want to have good working relationships. And when I'm negotiating my finances, I feel I'm doing much more than just taking care of myself monetarily. I'm also setting the tone for what I expect of my partners and collaborators. And setting that clear, open, kind communication, I feel has the biggest value of all. So as I look at wrapping up, I would love to field all kinds of questions from you, answer, if you want more examples or case studies or chat things out. I'm absolutely here to do that. We have lots of time to do so. I'd like to mention how you can work with me. First of all, on December 6th, I have a 4-hour year-end business planning workshop. It costs $99. It starts at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we go over everything from like setting your goals and your action steps to the year, breaking down the finances in a bit more detail than we did, say, tonight. And we always conclude with time dedicated to working on a pitch or a project proposal for the upcoming year. So you're not just walking away with sort of that feel-good sensation of, oh, I worked on my business, that's great, but also, hey, I have something concrete to use when I hit the ground running come January. And if you want to check out more information about that or sign up, it's on my website, which is just vanessachiasson.com/workshops. I also available for one-on-one coaching. I have both short focus feedback sessions of, just one-time meetings and others that go for like a 3-hour package done over, 3 weeks or whatever it might be for you. And last but not least, I hope you'll all subscribe to my newsletter on Substack, substack.com. Just search for me under Vanessa Chiasson and you will find me there. And I look forward to welcoming you into my newsletter community. And with that, I am going to turn things over to all of you if you have questions or things that you want to elaborate on. I see Steph laughing about the 8,000 Canadian. I stand by my interpretation of foreign exchange, and I think that that is an accurate financial number.
I think you lowballed it a little bit. Just a bit.
Yeah.
That was pretty not that bad, Vanessa. That was a lot of good information without being overwhelming for an hour. So thanks for
my pleasure.
Delivering it for me anyway, the right way. So.
My absolute pleasure. And this is such a great environment to talk about these things, because I think for so many of us, we're like, oh, like, how rude is it to talk about money? That's awkward. It feels weird. It's not something most people do. But there's still ways that you can have these open, frank, helpful discussions without necessarily anyone saying, oh, show me what's in your bank account this week. That's not what monetary discussions are about. It's having this really beneficial communication.
Questions?
We're getting into questions. Yeah, I have a question for Vanessa. First of all, thank you, Vanessa. That was great.
That's not a question.
Yeah, I'm getting to it.
Let the lady compliment me.
I have to thank her first. So you mentioned sponsored content, and that's an interesting one, because I'd love to know if, in your experience, it puts you down a road where if you do sponsored content for one publication, it might put you in a situation where another publication doesn't want to work with you because they are exclusively work with uncompromised journalists, let's say.
I am compromised in all sorts of ways. I've never encountered that. It's a great question. I actually have a segment on my website portfolio. Like I have like my travel portfolio. I have human interest stories. I have pieces that are just related to Ottawa, and then I have like corporate stories. And that includes things where I've done like more businessy type things and sponsored posts. And I mark them as such on my portfolio. Like this thing for BuzzFeed or Matador was sponsored. And to a certain extent, I think what in our work isn't sponsored to a certain effect. Like there's an element that so much of what we do is impacted by PR and sponsorship, even indirectly. It is really, really hard to have a journalist or a content creator who hasn't been impacted by that in some way. And even sometimes there's outlets that famously don't take content that comes from a press trip, most famously the New York Times. But you'll also see in places like the New York Times, and if they're ever listening to this, I love you, please take my pitches. They'll have things like, oh, this writer had like an amazing story about Costa Rica. And then what do you see like 2 weeks later in the New York Times? This gorgeous full color ad from the tourism board for Costa Rica. So there's an element of like, oh, thanks for doing that story. Here's a little treat for you, New York Times. So there's like other ways in which advertising and sponsorship kind of comes after effect. Not saying that that's anything, nefarious or whatnot, but even a place that says, oh, we don't take any sponsored stuff. Like there's an element of pleasing the advertisers. So I've never had any pushback from that kind of a thing. And it doesn't I don't get as many sponsored things from publications as I'd like. I wish they'd all come my way because they tend to pay better. But if they do, I'm open to it. And I think it's the same as like corporate style work. Like I've been given can you write biographies for the presidents of, vice presidents of the company or something, which is also very like SponCon-y in a way, because it's PR type writing. And I'm assuming that most publications editors assume that, in the freelance world, we all got to do what we have to do to make the money, Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Sherry's saying, haven't heard of a place that penalizes writers who write advertorial content. It's a good source of higher pay. Yeah. And, the opinions about how it should be written, that's a good point. Like sometimes I found that stuff is really heavily edited because they really want it to look like the sponsor has to completely agree with it. I did one for Matador back in 2020, and it was about visiting New Brunswick. And it was like 9 things you didn't know about New Brunswick or 9 places you should go. I thought, frankly, I did an amazing job because I grew up in Nova Scotia. I know New Brunswick really, really well. I had a few things there that were, not on your typical list, but they wanted the typical list. They wanted to be like, here are the highlights. And so I was like, maybe I shouldn't have worked so hard to be like, look how creative I can be. They just really wanted some classic content. So I was like, okay, back to the rewrite. So it wasn't awful, but I'm like, yeah, and this is kind of why you get paid a little bit more because the editing's going to be a little bit fussier. Yeah.
I have another question, but I want to let other people have a turn first.
Yeah.
Well, I just had a quick question, Vanessa. You mentioned pushback could be interpreted in many ways. Have you ever had to take a kill fee? And if so, did that have any influence on the relationship between you and the editor?
I've only had to take a kill fee once because in between when I had a piece accepted and before it was going to go to print, there was a huge reorg at the organization. And I want to say, was it Real Simple? It was one of the Door Dot Meredith. Is that Door Dot Meredith? Is that the big collective that owns like Real Simple and a lot of those different organizations? And they essentially paid me like half of what it was going to be. Dash Meredith, that's what it's called. They're the ones who own People, Better Home and Garden, All Recipes, Investopedia, Very Well, all those things. So I had a kill fee there because it was a case of we've shut down. Here's sort of like a courtesy thing. And incidentally, I've been trying to place that flippin' piece ever since. Because I'm like, great, I'll sell it to someone else. I'll make a fortune. No. I do know that other writers have had pieces killed for a lot of reasons. Political situation has changed or creative conflict with the editor in terms of what way the piece was going and stuff like that. And I think when it's handled well, even though it can be disappointing, it's a sign like, hey, this was a good, the best case scenario for handling this awkward situation. And when it goes badly, I guess sort of everyone reveals their true colors and how they're really, what they think about communicating with writers and stuff like that. So it's kind of a interesting litmus test of like how things really go. So hopefully I don't get many more kills. That would be bad.
But my question was that, did you ever write for them again? I guess that's basically what I was curious.
I've pitched them again, and they were like kind of responsive. I never got a yes, but in that case, like the editor moved to a different vertical that wasn't really in my wheelhouse as much. So I wasn't necessarily anticipating a lot of yes, but I would absolutely pitch them again. And they did like respond kindly to the things that I had pitched. It just didn't work out. And like, there was no hard feelings as to why it was killed. Right. Because it was more a corporate decision and it was, then the breaks.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I have to go, but I appreciated it.
Thank you, Bruce. It's so awesome to see you again.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, I'll jump back in if there's no more other questions. So you mentioned you have a separate portfolio site.
Yeah.
I've been kind of treating LinkedIn as my portfolio site. Do you find there's value in also maintaining a separate portfolio site aside from that?
I do for a couple of reasons. One is that I own nothing on LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn could turn around tomorrow and say, hey, if you want to stay on LinkedIn, it's going to cost you $1 for each connection you have or something. I don't think they will, but it's entirely possible. I also know that not everyone is on LinkedIn and there's all different kinds of factors, including things like I use, when I'm in my workday, I often use like a social media blocker. So I can't get distracted by things on social media. If an editor is using that same thing and I'm like, check out my work on LinkedIn, they might not do so because they're like, oh, I've shut off my social media for my workday or whatnot. So I like having a portfolio for a couple of reasons, not just because it feels like I'm in control of sharing that content. It's also so I can organize it the way I want. And for me, it's putting forward, I do travel, I do human interest stories, I cover Ottawa a fair bit because I live here. And, if in case you're curious about giving me big money for corporate work, here's my corporate portfolio. So I can organize it as I want. And tomorrow, if I want to put a different foot forward, if I want to be like, hey, I'm your favorite food writer, I could easily reshuffle how I'm presenting that. And it allows me to do things like highlighting pieces that I'm particularly proud of to say, like, this one won an award or something. And what I find most valuable for me actually is that I often forget what I have written. Because like there's some clients where I've done like a lot of pieces for, and if I'm sending clips into another editor to say like, you should work with me, here's who I am, check out my portfolio, here's a couple of clips, recent clips for your convenience. And I'm like, wait, I'm sure I've written about France before. Who did I write those things for? And I literally like search my own portfolio and be like, oh, right, I did a piece for this and a piece for that. So I'll include it in my clips to showcase. But like often I'll be like, I forgot that I did that piece because it might have been 5 years ago, but it might be really still relevant. So I like having kind of control of things myself. I know some people like just doing a very simplified portfolio. Like they like to do just here's 5 or 10 examples for each category of work that I'm great for. Here's like my shining star examples. But I like to kind of have every single piece with like a drop down menu so it doesn't look too cluttered just because I'm using it so much more than I'm sure any editor will. So I like it for my own organization's sake.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So if you were looking to do one on your own, I would say don't put tons of time, money, or effort into it in the sense of like, this shouldn't be like a 3-month long project to get a portfolio up and running. Maybe it should be an afternoon project to get up with like your 5 favorite clips and then decide, how do I want this to look? Whose stuff do I want to look at and maybe emulate their style, all that thing. Don't let it become shallow work, in other words,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else that I could answer questions, concerns, more information that anyone needs, I'd be happy to do so.
Anything from you, Lori?
Unmute here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about pitching. You mentioned that you pitched 14 times.
Mm-hmm.
I pitched a story idea to an editor 3 times, which I thought was absolutely perfect for them.
Yeah.
But I never heard anything back. So what would you do in that case?
So my success in pitching is because, frankly, I'm just stubborn. I'm like, I'm going to stick with this until I wear someone down. So that is my whole MO. And so I recognize that there are so many reasons why an editor will say yes or no that have absolutely nothing to do with me, my talent, my story, or even how perfect the story might be for them. Because we have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know if they've recently, say, got a bunch of funding to focus on a certain type of story. We don't know if they were looking at covering a different aspect of that city that summer anyway. I've often heard from editors who are like, hey, we love this pitch, but we've already covered Ottawa this year. And I'm like, I guess so now I know you do it one a year. I also know that a lot of publications say like, oh, we work with freelancers, but they almost always keep a lot of things in-house. So in theory, they work with freelancers, maybe not so much. I typically pitch, I follow up within 2 weeks to kind of give a nudge. And if I don't hear anything, I move on. I try someone else. That doesn't preclude me from pitching them again. I know there's some editors and some publications where the editor's like very notorious for like, they never get back unless they love the idea, in which case they're on it right away. And that's just their style. So it's always worthwhile to maybe ask a trusted friend, like, hey, have you ever written for this person or this publication? Like, what are they like? And see kind of maybe to feel out what their particular style is. I really love it when an editor has just, and why all editors don't do this, I don't know, have just like a standardized canned email template that says, thanks for your pitch, not a great fit for us, please try again. Like, surely that would save them from getting so many follow-ups from people like
Right.
can't be desiring Vanessa's follow-up email every 2 weeks. So like, why don't they just do this? But that's, who can say, right? But occasionally I've been discouraged. I've also have shared a pitch with a friend to say, hey, am I missing something on this? And like sometimes people might say, well, this could be a bit of a punchier title or something. So I always want to like make sure, like, am I coming at this in the right way? Like maybe I've pitched it so many times I've kind of gone blind to it a bit. But sometimes you also don't know when things will just fall into your lap in a weird way. And the example of like the 15 times, right? I got pitched, it fit into Thrillist. And the reason it got picked up, other than I'm sure my inherent brilliance just shining through the screen, was they had gotten funding for a project. It was a road trip based thing. They were looking for road trip type activities out of their principal cities, one of which is Miami. And so I was pitching about the Turtle Hospital in Marathon, Florida, about 2 hours from Miami. Perfect. And the editor happened to also like really just love ecologically minded projects. And they're like, yeah, this is great. Like it just happened, boom, like that. They're wonderful to work with. They haven't responded to a single one of my pitches since. Well, that's not like, I'm like, well, they obviously love me. Why wouldn't they love me? Because I gave them what they wanted and it was on deadline and they thought my photos were great. So they clearly adore me. But they are working on something else that's like a different fit or like a different kind of vibe. So I'm not like, I wish I could say that like rejection just rolls on my back. It doesn't. There's times when I've been like so frustrated, I've cried because they're just stories, they're my stories. And like I want to do
Yeah.
right by them. And there's so many things that go into it. And frankly, I want the money. Like I want to be paid to do my job that I love. But I also know like I don't have to be the best writer, the most brilliant pitcher. Like I just need to kind of outlast everyone with my stubbornness. And I'm sitting on another story right now that after 14 pitches, yet again, this must be the magic number, on number 15, they're like, oh, we like this. We're going to take it to like the meeting for consideration 2025. And I'm like, ah, so clearly you have to do this 14 times. And then the 15th is the charm. And I try to have my system sort of as efficient as possible to track like who I'm sending it to, when I send it, when do I have to follow up? So I frankly don't forget, like, who did I send this to? Because it can get all messed up in your mind after a while, especially if there's like, there's Canadian Geographic and National Geographic. Like, which one of them did I send it to? So my advice is like to be stubborn, to keep going, to ask a friend, hey, look this over to make sure I'm not like missing maybe something that could be tightened up here. And to follow up, like to follow up after a week or two, whatever happens to be reasonable for that publication. Because if they don't have an autoresponder, then they deserve your follow-up email, like in their box, like nudging them a little bit, I think.
And you mentioned Cottage Life as being wonderful to work with. Are there any other favorites that you have that you've had good success with being open to story pitches?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's each one is sort of a unique relationship. I'm very lucky that I've had very few that I'd be like, these guys are jerks, stay away. I've had 2 pieces with Saltscape. So I've definitely had more no's than yeses from them. But I like writing for them. Like I like the material that they cover, being from the East Coast originally. This publication matters to me. It's really great to see stories there. And I find that they consider everything. So I feel like they often say things like, hey, we're taking this to a staff meeting. If you don't hear by such and such a date, like follow up in case it slipped my mind. So I value that kind of communication. I have found like at Canadian Geographic that when they like a piece, they respond right away and give like positive feedback and talk about how they want to move forward. And if a piece isn't right, they might not be so quick on the responding back. And so sometimes people are like, oh, like, are they not enjoying my pitches there? I'm like, no. Like, I can tell you from my experience that they're really warm and effusive and friendly and awesome, when they're giving their acceptance. But they often, I think because they get pitched so often that they don't have time to give like a no to every person. And that's reasonable. But I really enjoy working for them. I just submitted something for them. And I like that they cover smaller destinations or unknown stories that aren't covered a whole lot. So that means a lot to me. I was actually on a phone call today with an editor. An editor wanted to talk with me like with words before saying something. I'm like, what kind of monstrosity of a situation is this that I have to get on like a Zoom call with an editor? I was like, oh my gosh, like terrifying. I'm like, don't they know that like 10 hours later tonight, I have a call with like the team from TMAC Ontario. I can't handle 2 of these in a day. But it's from an organization called Ambrook Research. Ambrook Research does agricultural focused pieces in the United States, which is quite niche. But I had visited a farm in the United States, which I felt had a much broader story that had to be told. And I hadn't worked for them before. And they were like, let's talk this out. So I was like, okay, like crazy person who gets on the phone with you. But I'm so glad it was because A, they said yes, but B, they're like, hey, like this is what my editing style is like. They're like, this is how I like to communicate. Like I was like, this is awesome. Like I think they were really putting that emphasis on like we want a lot of clear, positive communication. So I think as travel writers, it's so valuable when we branch out and not just do purely travel, like doing like agricultural writing. Like, who would have thought? I don't know anything about chickens, but I knew, like, I knew that this farm and their education program had something really special. It's a human interest piece. So there's really been a lot of incredible people from so many different destinations. I find chatelaine is always really, really excellent to work with. Sometimes their edits come back with plenty of edits, and I'm like, oh my gosh, do they hate it? But no, they're just like, they are really passionate about telling the best possible story. And sometimes their edits say things like, I like this point, or I like how you phrase this. So I'm like, oh, you're not just editing, you're leaving me like nice little feedback as you go. I'm like, how nice is this?
Yeah.
So I I never used to like edits. I just wanted every editor to be like, this piece was perfect. Here's a big sack of gold for your efforts. Like, see you again next week, which shockingly doesn't occur that often. And I hated edits because I hated the idea of like, I did something wrong. I clearly failed the editor if I didn't have a perfect paragraph. Or like, who wants to get criticism? We already get enough rejection in our lives. Who wants criticism on top of that? So in 2020, when the pandemic was slowing things down, I was like, I need to get over this because if I want to survive, I need to pitch outlets that have a reputation for being tough editors. And I have to make that jump between knowing intellectually that there's nothing wrong with getting a firm edit, but emotionally not feeling devastated by it. Like, I don't know what that gap is. So I actually hired people out of my own pocket, and I said, I want you to give who are also editors, like freelance. And I said, I want you to edit this piece for my blog. So there's no, it's not being pitched just for my blog. But I'm like, I'm going to get you to give me a BBC level edit because the BBC is notorious for their editing. I'm like, I want you to red tape, red ink the living bejesus out of it because I just want to get used to seeing that. I want to get used to be open to this feedback. And it sucked. I did not enjoy paying money to experience that, but it has made me better for it. And I realized if someone can edit you and you feel, all right, this was tough, but fair, I will go back to that editor all the time. If someone feels more mercurial or a bit petty or a bit snippy in their editing, I'm like, nope, I don't want that style of communication. I'd rather you give me 100 tough but fair edits than 2 or 3 snippy comments. That's how things work for me. So it was definitely a very worthwhile thought experiment to kind of go through that process for sure.
I actually quit a publication over that once. Every time I filed a car review with this one publication, the editor would come back and it was just really belittling comments. And I think he was trying to give constructive feedback, but it was things like, you said you used these 4 words and you should have said it this other way. And right. And I had ended up just not being worth my mental health to continue to work with the person.
And it's really difficult when someone says, oh, you mentioned that there were mugs of coffee. I think you should have said cups of coffee. I'm like, that sounds like a personal choice. That does not sound like it affects the story at all, that it improves the flow of the story, that it changes anything about the story. It just sounds like you're changing it to sound more like you than like me. In which case, why did you hire me? So there's times when I'm like, sure, fine, whatever you want, because I'm not so invested in the cups versus mugs situation that I'm going to let it affect me. Other times I'm like, I can see how we go down this path. You are so not who I want to work with on, say, a personal essay or something of that nature. On a few occasions, I've had to push back with editors, but it was also always when I had a good relationship with them. And one example would be I did a piece for the Queen's University Alumni Review. Actually, it was their summer piece. It was about Queen's students who are alumni who are now in the wine industry in various areas. And in one thing, the editor was making some adjustments to the opening paragraph. And I was like, my opening paragraph, I thought it was perfect. But they always have to adjust for the style and tone of the magazine. So it was okay. But they used a phrase, something like old world or new world wines. And I was like, actually, I'd like to cut this line because I think this is sort of more of a phrase that might be associated with colonial style language, talk about old world versus new, where we could talk about European traditions in winemaking or Australian traditions in winemaking. There's different ways we can word this that are more effective. And the editor was fine with that. They're like, oh, I hadn't considered that. Thank you. And so that's absolutely the kind of editorial relationship I'm looking for, where I can say, please don't cut this line. It matters to me and here's why. Or I really don't like this phrasing and here's why. But the others say like, all right, but this needs to be punchier, or we need to like have this go more full circle, or I don't really see how this paragraph fits in. I might hate hearing it, but I'm like, all right, I know that you're doing right by me when you're sort of editing in this way. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So
Any other last questions? Oh.
We've got you for 5 more minutes.
Excellent.
So any last questions from anybody?
And if there's not, I'll use my last 5 minutes to tell everyone here and everyone who's watching afterwards that you absolutely can do this. I am not a natural negotiator. This is not where I love being. I wish I didn't have to. I wish, like I said, those editors would just show up with sacks of gold and wouldn't have to worry about it all. But I feel like this is what I have to do to have my highest value work, both financially and for other factors. So there's no reason why not everyone who's listening to this, on your next assignment, on your next project, to simply say, hey, is there any extra room in the budget? And it doesn't matter in a way if they say yes or no. What matters is you've started doing it. And I find the easiest way is to just make it a non-negotiable part of what your work is. Like, no matter what the assignment, no matter what the project, you always, always, always ask. Because if you give yourself an excuse to say, well, I'm not going to do it when it's more than this amount of money, because I don't want to seem greedy, there'll always be a reason to not ask. Or if you'll say, it's not worth doing for something that just pays $100, who cares about the extra $20? You're always going to find a reason to kind of apply that logic to other situations. So I think having negotiating be a non-negotiable part of your work life as a freelancer, as someone who's self-employed, is invaluable for so many ways. So I hope you all will consider doing it.
That's a pretty solid ending.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here. I greatly appreciate everyone's time and communication and questions.
Thank you.
Hold on one sec.